Meera lived on the banks of a great river. Her father built boats for the fishermen, and her mother cared for Meera, her two young brothers, and their elderly grandmother who had dementia and needed special attention. Meera was a bright and helpful girl who dreamed of growing up to be a teacher. The people who lived on the banks knew how to deal with the yearly floods that had come for as long as anyone could remember. They were also used to the storms that came up the river from the sea. But with changes in the climate, storms were becoming less predictable and much stronger than before. Meera's grandmother said that the weather patterns were now so different from what she could remember when she was younger. This year's storm was more powerful than anything they had ever seen. The weather system caused the sea level to rise and sent a powerful wave surging up the river towards Meera's home. No one was expecting this. And when the wave hit the houses, there was chaos and destruction. Some wooden houses were smashed by the wave, and others were torn from their moorings and carried by the water. Meera's home was washed up onto the higher ground and crashed onto its side. The disaster brought tragedy for many families, including Meera's. Her elderly grandmother was killed when the house toppled over, and her father's spine was seriously damaged, paralyzing him from the waist down. The family had to move to a temporary camp many miles away. Life changed for Meera after the disaster. Her mother went to work in a house in another town to earn for the family, since Meera's father could no longer work. Her father put a brave face on his disability, but Meera saw him grow more and more depressed because he could not move around. The whole family missed her grandmother. With her mother working and no one else to help the family, Meera dropped out of school to care for her father and her brothers. She lost contact with her friends who had been displaced to a different camp, and it seemed like now she would never get to become a teacher. People in the camps were often frustrated and angry because their lives were hard, and Meera didn't feel safe moving around by herself. Every day before she slept, Meera prayed that the suffering that her family and others like them faced would be relieved, and that they could have a happy life again. One night, in her dreams, she saw a strange machine. It was a disaster rewind machine that could turn back time. It had 4 settings, and Meera turned the dial to the first, Preparedness. Suddenly, Meera was transported back to a time just before the storm. She could see that there were volunteers being prepared to respond to hazards and support people who were affected in their aftermath. She saw government officials and community groups discussing plans for temporary housing and assistance. A psychologist was explaining how important it was to provide social and emotional support to people who were affected by a crisis. She also explained that this would help them cope with a disaster and reduce the chances of longer-term problems. Then, Meera saw the storm surge strike again, causing terrible destruction once more. However, this time, the community volunteers were quick to come to the assistance of the affected people. They comforted Meera's family as they mourned her grandmother and provided practical support to her father in overcoming barriers to access the services he needed. The temporary shelters were organized to keep neighbors and relatives close together. So, when Meera's mother had to work to feed the family, someone they knew helped to look after Meera's father and brothers while she went to school. At school, the teachers were especially kind to the children who had lost family and encouraged the students to help one another with practical things like homework assignments and sharing school supplies. There was one girl in Meera's class who found it hard to concentrate and frequently cried in school. So her teacher arranged for her to see a counselor who had been trained to help children who were struggling after the disaster. Meera's father also got support from a community group and received training to take up a new job at a shop. He became more confident about living with his disability. Slowly, Meera's family put their life together again. Meera looked at the disaster rewind machine and turned the dial back to mitigation and prevention. Once again, she was transported back to the period before the terrible storm. This time, she saw people, including her father, shifting all the wooden houses towards the edge of the floodplain. She saw her father explaining to the children that all the adults had discussed and agreed to do this to protect the houses from high flooding, and that the stronger, higher houses would keep them safe and reduce the risks of damage to their homes. Other people were making plans to be able to move their livestock to higher ground. The government was also announcing a new early warning system by radio and SMS message to alert people of hazards like strong storms or flooding. Meera's family also received a visit from a community health worker from her grandmother's clinic to make sure they were prepared to evacuate her if necessary. This time, when the storm surge came, Meera saw that the houses stood strong above the waves. The children and adults inside had already been warned of the danger by the government and had moved their livestock and boats to higher ground. They were all confident about the measures they had taken to protect themselves and were less afraid. When the storm cleared, there was only minor damage to the houses, and no one had been seriously injured. Even though she was dreaming, Meera cried with joy to see that her grandmother was alive and her father was walking about. Everyone in the community helped to clean up after the storm, their bonds even stronger for having worked together to prevent harm. Meera didn't want to leave this happy part of her dream, but she knew she had to turn the dial to explore the final setting: response and recovery. This brought her back to reality, where her family was suffering after the disaster. However, this time she saw people talking about how they needed to rebuild their community so that the disaster would never happen again. There were organizations helping people like her father speak about their experiences and suggest ways to rebuild the houses more safely. There was a scheme to help families like hers to start small businesses, so her mother was able to move back to work from home. The government increased the number of social workers to help children stay in school, and disaster preparedness and prevention was introduced as a topic in their curriculum, so that everyone grew up with knowledge of how to prepare for and protect themselves from hazards. This made people more confident about facing these and better able to cope with the stress of an emergency. When Meera woke up from her dream, she thought long and hard. She knew what she wanted to do. Everything the disaster rewind machine had shown her was about how people can take action to reduce or prevent the harm and pain of disasters. This was so important, but Meera wondered why people didn't do anything to stop or reduce hazards like these destructive storms in the first place. Her grandmother had said that the changes in the climate were caused by people's effects on nature, but that they didn't care enough to stop this. Meera made up her mind that she would do whatever she could to prevent more disasters like the storm that harmed her family. She now had a new goal in life. Like Meera, around the world, many people are working to address the causes and drivers of the different kinds of crises that occur where they live. Like them, we each have a role to play in preventing, preparing for, and responding to disasters to reduce the suffering of families and communities and protect their well-being.